let's see. I've often heard that atheism is the denial of the Abrahamic God, but denial is the active rejection of a substantiated fact. That's not what that means. Once credible evidence has been presented, it's not what it means to be an atheist. He said, it is natural, rational, and prudent to be skeptical. So he says of unsubstantiated claims, sure, but the first thing to realize is that religious belief is actually intuitive, and that's actually substantiated by scientific evidence. So, so not only is it not true what he said, but it's also true the opposite because religious belief or belief in something as we would classically understand it to be religious or supernatural is intuitive. It's an argument against intuition, which means that the burden of proof is not on us but on him, because when you argue against your intuition, you're arguing against something that you have, I would say, you have reason to trust. We intuitively think that let's say, like, if you're gonna go and sit in a chair, you have an intuition that the laws of the universe, you may not think about it, but the laws of the universe are going to stay the same when you sit in that chair, and it's not going to, gravity is not going to work anymore, but you have an intuition about something, and so you believe it. And so if you want to argue against something that's intuitive, you must give me a reason why I shouldn't believe in it, not why I should believe in it because it's intuitive.
Yeah, I think that's a great point really to start off, just that, okay, ground zero is not atheism. That is not default.
Yeah,
When we see beauty, the default is artist. Sure, maybe it turns out there's no artist. We'll get to that in a minute. When we see complexity, we assume intelligence. That's default. That's ground zero. So maybe it turns out atheism is true, but assuming design, because we see beauty, because we see complexity, because we see life, because we see order, that's not absurd. That's not unsubstantiated. That's what we assume by default. As children, that's what we grow up assuming, unless we're indoctrinated otherwise. So ground zero is not atheism. It's belief in a higher power. So now that doesn't mean it's true, but ground zero is not atheism, it's theism. Okay,
Yeah.
So it starts like this. I define atheism as suspending acknowledgement of the existence of gods until sufficient evidence can be presented. My position is that I have no good evidence to acknowledge the existence of God. Okay, what is substantial evidence? What would you need to assume the existence of God? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a complete redefinition of what atheism has been historically. That's not atheism. Atheism is when you make a positive claim, God does not exist, there is no God. This is more of an agnostic position. Yeah. So I just want to say that firstly. If you say you're an atheist, I mean, you can go and redefine what you want to redefine, but I don't have to use your radical redefinitions. And so I know it's trying to shift the burden of proof, because when you make a positive claim, most of the time you have to prove it. So, or you have to make a case for it, but we'll move on.
So he put, and here's the evidence as to why I currently hold such a position. So once again, like, it seems like he's starting off as agnostic, but then he's giving evidence for why he holds such a position. So it does appear to be a positive belief in that sense, but we'll just leave that there. So number one. So first, I personally have never observed a God. Second, I have never encountered a person who has claimed to observe a God.
Yeah, so I wouldn't expect you to. At least the God that I worship, I wouldn't expect you to have observed. Well, I guess it depends on what you mean observed. What I mean is, if you say, because I haven't seen this thing with my own two eyes, therefore I don't believe in it. Firstly, I would say you don't do that for most things in your life. Say love, say history. And then secondly, the God that I worship, the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, I wouldn't expect you to observe him with your two eyes, because neither have I, but I still believe in him. So this isn't a matter of a natural question, but it's a supernatural instance that we're talking about. So if you want to use, a metal detector to try and find plastic, I want to tell you you're wrong. But that's just not the way you should go about it.
Yeah, I think it's important to ask, okay, what do you mean by observe? Do you mean see? Do you mean touch? Do you mean feel? If that's the case, then even if he does exist, then you wouldn't know. God, if he exists, as we see in our arguments, he's immaterial. He's timeless. If he's immaterial, what's he made of? You're not going to touch him. You're not going to see him in that sense. So if you make that argument, then you're going to be wrong. Even if he's true, you're not going to know. I feel like that's what we need to see. There's a difference between empirical science and forensic science. Empirical deals with, okay, what we can touch, what we can feel, what we can test. Whereas forensic science is more about, okay, what happened in the past? The fact is, even if, say, God were a material being, obviously he's not. But even if we can't observe him right now, does that mean that he's never existed? No, even if this so-called material being did something in the past just once, that would prove he existed. We don't need to continue to observe him again and again and again in order to prove he exists. Now we see that God is not a material being, so you would not expect to see him that way. But the fact is, even if he just came once, then he exists. We don't need to be able to observe him again and again and again in order to find that he exists. There's no one who would say, oh, I've never observed a Mayan, therefore I don't believe Mayans existed or ever existed. Obviously, they were a people of the past. They were a tribe of the past. Now you might say, okay, but they existed, but then they died. It's not a modern tribe. It's not a modern thing. Whereas God, if he exists, he didn't end. He still exists. But the point is, even if he just came out once in history to prove himself, we wouldn't need to see him again and again and again. Those, by definition, even in Christianity, are rare events getting to observe directly. I feel like that's really the point. There's a difference between direct observation and indirect observation. We can indirectly observe that the Mayans existed. We don't directly see them. And I feel like that's really where the evidence for Christianity is. We go to indirect observations. We use forensic science to see past events that occurred. We use eyewitness accounts. We use historical records. That's what we use. Those are indirect. We don't get to see these things directly. So we need to see that we believe in God not because we see him directly, but because we see him indirectly. We can find these out by effects. I don't even see gravity directly. It's working constantly. But I can see that it exists by its effects, what it results in. So that's the big point here. Just because we can't see God directly doesn't mean he doesn't exist. There are indirect observations that all of us find intuitively obvious that we can see might point to this God, and that's enough. We don't need more than that.
Yeah, and then I also wanted to look at number 2. I've never encountered a person who has claimed to observe a God. And so here's where I would say, if a God did exist, it's an objective truth. Just like if Ash exists, and it's maybe it's contingent, but it's true in reality that Ash exists. You may have never encountered someone who gave testimony about Ash, but I have. I even know Ash. What's my point? You base everything off your personal experience, but if you base your worldview only on what you've experienced, you would not believe in a lot of stuff that you believe in. And so you personally may have never encountered. An encounter in that sense gives me the sense of within my lifetime someone I've met. But just read history. Even the famous creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which is supposed to have circulated very early, they claim to have seen a risen Jesus who they believed was God. And so already there in history, I have someone who claimed to have seen God. And we said he's not material. That's true. But we also recognize the incarnation for a limited period of time.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. It's not even that Christianity is all based directly on indirect observations. Like, it's not like, oh, everybody from all past history has just had this same so-called indirect observation of God, that we all just assume he's out there based on these loosely connected arguments. No, you're right. He came. He came as an actual guy in the historical count. We see that all these things show that he actually came, and you can find the link to that below that we'll include. So once again, it's not all indirect. There are actually people who saw God directly and had a reason to believe it. Right. Yeah. So I think that kind of leads us on to the next one, which, I feel like we'll get into the historical evidence a bit. So number 3, I know of no accounts of persons claiming to have observed a God that were willing or able to demonstrate or verify their observation for authenticity, accuracy, or validity.
Well, he's already said that he's never encountered a person to have claimed to observe a God. So of course he's never going to encounter someone who's observed. He already said he didn't encounter anyone who's observed a God. So why would he expect to encounter someone who not only has observed a God, but also can give, some substantiated argument? Like you already said that the first premise of your question, you've never experienced. So number 3, I want to say it doesn't really contribute much. If I want to get to the point of it, It's saying, imagine if it was phrased, if I knew someone that claimed to, they never did, but even then it's just changing his question or
Yeah.
changing his claim.
Yeah, so my question would be, okay, what would you expect someone to do if they actually experience this and then it actually turns out to be true? What would you want from them? Because actually, I think that even by his own standards, we actually do have these accounts. Take a look at the Gospels. I mean, these early believers, they were martyred. They honestly believed this occurred. And they weren't stupid. They know people don't rise from the dead. That's exactly why they believed that this guy was God. I mean, they believed that they saw him risen from the dead. And that's another argument. So were they able to prove it? Yeah, there are these witnesses. And isn't that enough for you? I mean, let's say that we claim we see a UFO. Obviously, you might not be so ready to believe that. You might be skeptical. What if we say, okay, 72 people saw it? That's eyewitness accounts. That's now you might still be skeptical, but that is certainly a piece of evidence that you're going to consider.
And go ask them.
Upwards of 72 people in the Gospels, I think, recorded of who supposedly saw Jesus. And that were said that you could go ask these people. You can ask them yourselves. Most of them are still alive. So there are accounts of people who are willing to die for it. They believed it. That's the point. And liars make poor martyrs, as we've been talking about a lot recently. And these aren't just people who believed it, who were hoping this would happen. We have at least two skeptics, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. Paul, who was persecuting the church. This guy was an enemy. He hated this. He thought that they were a false cult. So you have two unlikely people who are going to come out and also give their lives for it. These two people we know for sure died for it. Now, why would these skeptics give their lives for something that they thought was a lie all along? So you're saying, okay, I've never heard someone give an account that they were able to verify. Now, this is a historical event. How are they going to verify it?
You gotta go ask them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they've written their accounts. They've changed their whole life. It literally changed their whole life. And the fact is, if he didn't rise from the dead, if they didn't observe God, then it would have died then and there. We'll find just the opposite. It didn't just stay there, but it grew explosively. I feel like that's really the biggest point. If there's ever been a confirmation, it was right there at the early church. And then we could even get into the subject of miracles. Right then at the early church, the early apostles were said to perform miracles. Now, if you're an atheist, you're skeptical. I can see that you might be skeptical, push back from miracles. We have a video that if God exists, miracles are possible. So the point is, don't say that you've never seen accounts that people were unable to claim this and verify it. You're just assuming that they couldn't verify it because of your worldview, that miracles aren't possible because God doesn't exist. So this is really a historical question. We see that there's good historical evidence for this. So let's move to the next one, number 4. I've never been presented a valid logical argument which also employed sound premises that lead deductively to a conclusion that a god or gods exists.
When I was reading this, I thought it was interesting. So I would say when he says a valid logical argument, he means something that follows. And then he also makes sure that it's reasonable when he says, so not only will it follow, but also that it has sound premises. Because you could have an argument that follows through a syllogism or through something like that, but the premises aren't real. Like you just have false premises. So he needs sound premises that lead deductively to a conclusion that God exists or a God or gods exists, and he seems to have never been presented with them. And then number 5 says, of the 46 logical syllogisms I've encountered, I don't know what to tell you. You know, you probably heard the ones I'm going to tell you, and why you're not convinced, I'm not sure. I'm convinced. Many other people are convinced. And I think one thing that's unique is he not only does he say I'm not convinced by it, he says they are bad arguments. And so things like the Kalam, you know, I feel like if we talked about the Kalam, he would say it doesn't follow that God exists, and certainly not the God of the Bible. Yeah, it doesn't follow that the God of the Bible exists, and it doesn't follow that I guess we could say God exists. But as Ash just talked about in other videos, there is this force, if we can call it a force, which is fully actualized, extremely powerful, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, has all these qualities that we attribute to the monotheistic God of the Bible. Not proving it's the God of the Bible yet, but the main point is that we know of arguments, and if you say that you've never been presented with them, I think it would probably help us if you left another comment and just said which ones are popular or something, and then we could respond to that as well. Because as it stands, this is just kind of it's kind of just out there saying I've never heard of any of them, and I don't know what to respond to that because they could be anything.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I feel like what you said that I think find the best takeaway for these 2 points. I think God is a very vague term. You ask different people, they mean something very different by God. So are you going to expect a logical argument to prove logically that God exists? God being a very vague term, it's kind of difficult to get that as the concise conclusion. But what we do find in arguments is that there are different descriptions which do emerge. For example, we look at the effect, the universe. We assume a cause. That does come out of the argument. We look at the fine-tuning of the universe. We get design. That does come out of the argument. We look at the message in life. We get intelligence. That does come out of the argument. We look at morality, moral law. We realize that that can't exist unless there's a purpose, a plan in life. A planner does come out of the argument. So you're not going to get God out of a logical argument, but you will get a cause with certain qualities. You'll get a designer. You'll get intelligence. You'll get a planner. And so does God directly come out of the argument? No, but these qualities do. And what do you assume these qualities are? That's what we mean by God. So I think that the big point here is if you're looking for an argument that's going to give you God, literally like premise equals God, you're not going to ever find that just because God is a very vague term. But what you will find abundantly in these arguments is that you will get all these descriptions of exactly what we mean by God, an intelligent designer, a personal being, a cause that exists eternally, and it's powerful. I think you get the idea that you're not going to get God out of an argument, but you're going to get powerful descriptions. If those aren't enough, then I think you're cheating yourself out of it. You're not going to find it, even if this does exist. So 6, I have never observed a phenomenon in which the existence of a God was a necessary antecedent for the known or probable explanation for the causation of that phenomenon.
Me, I'm 17, and that means I wasn't there when life started. I wasn't there when the universe started. And even if you're an 80-year-old who left this comment, neither were you. And a lot of the arguments that we have or that we give in to make a case for God, um, they are based around life. They're based around the origins of things. And so while you may have never observed a phenomenon in which the existence of God, it sounds like a miracle. I've never observed a miracle. That could be a stretch, but something which God was necessary or probable. Um, just because you've never seen something like that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. That'd be a terrible assumption to make. I mean, just because I've never observed the creation of the universe, which it seems pretty probable that an explanation is a timeless, immaterial, spaceless figure, which seems an awful lot like God. It doesn't mean that it never happened or that whatever is the cause is nothing or not God. It's an argument trying to base it on the fact that you haven't seen it with your 2 eyes. You want some sort of empirical or experiential verification of something, which is, it seems inherently would be extremely rare. And so I'm not surprised that you've never observed phenomena, but that isn't an argument against God. Um, you might be able to say, like, you might just be able to say, that's why I personally don't believe it. Okay. But you haven't disproved or proved anything yet.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I feel like it goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier. Does God need to keep intervening again and again and again for us to believe in him? No, even if he just intervened once, that's reason enough to believe in him. I mean, when he intervenes, as we've talked about in another video, that's when miracle occurs. And miracles by definition are rare. I mean, even in the Bible, they occur, I think, in 3 groups. So Moses, Elisha, and Elijah, and the time of Jesus and the apostles. So we see that that is a lot. I think that if you divided them all evenly across the span of history, you'd get about 1 miracle every 8 years. Now, even if that were the case, that's not very often, is it? No, but instead we find it grouped into these short amount of times. Literally in the Gospels, you find a ton of miracles performed in a very little amount of time. So that's just an idea of how few miracles have occurred in the history of the universe. So you're definitely not going to expect to find them, even if they were to occur as often as once every 8 years. So once again, if you're basing it all on this, that you're only going to believe it if you observe it directly, then you're cheating yourself out of finding it if it does indeed exist.
Yeah, and another thing to consider, it doesn't also mean that just because something isn't recorded that it couldn't like actually have happened. I'm sure there might have been other miracles, answered prayers, things like that, that just weren't recorded. But the point is, this isn't an everyday thing.
Yeah.
So basing it off your own spirit, like experiential kind of experience is just, it seems like it's the wrong way to go about investigating this question.
All right, next, number 7. Several proposed and generally accepted explanations for observable phenomena that were previously based on the agency of a god or gods have subsequently been replaced with rational, natural explanations, each substantiated with evidence that excluded the agency of God or of gods. I have never encountered vice versa.
So this isn't an argument, and I don't know. Let's see. He started and said, and here's the evidence as to why I currently hold. So he views this as an evidence to have no good reason to acknowledge the existence of God. Um, Even if I take it as that, you've never encountered vice versa. Well, I don't know if you know this, but for most of history, the universe was considered eternal. And with science, we know that it's not eternal. It had a beginning. And so all of a sudden, we have something that appeared to be explained by the wisest of people. I won't say science because scientific revolution hadn't happened yet. It'd come after. So it's definitely not science. But that was the widely held view. And then, bam, you know what? We do need a beginning. And then, bam, this beginning or whatever precedes it has to have these qualities. We talk about the kalam a lot. It's because it's important. The origin of the whole universe. That's a pretty important thing. And then just because something is explained away, like that doesn't mean anything. I mean, if I held that Zeus caused lightning, and then in reality I know that it was something else that caused it, sure I could lose faith in Zeus, but the God of the Bible, that's not the way he operates things. He made this universe to run, and when he made it that way. And so we don't need God, or nor do we find him constantly being the cause in a sense of the way we understand causation, like in normal vocabulary, of things like, I don't know, like the rain. And so just because something else has explained something we knew was unknown, that doesn't mean that it disproves God. Like it just doesn't follow at all. Um, and this could easily become a science of the gaps argument. And those are really annoying where, no, eventually science will explain everything. Well, you can have that faith, but I'm not going to agree with your science of the gaps argument.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's really what he's describing here. He's trying to make a God of the gaps argument that, the more we do science, the more these gaps that we put God in are being filled up. I think that this really goes back to the important distinction between forensic science and empirical science. It's giving that the more we do empirical science, which is what most people think of as simply science, the more we understand how the world works. Therefore, God is not necessary. He's not in the equation. We're not going to assume his existence because we don't need him. But there's a big difference between understanding how a system operates in its day-to-day workings and how the system originated. I'm sure you can see the difference. The more I understand a Ford car, the more I examine it, does that release the need to assume Henry Ford's existence? No. The more I look at it, the more I see the design, the more I appreciate the detail. Now, obviously, it's going to work just fine without Henry Ford being right there in it. I'm not going to find him in it. But it's going to point back to its origin. I'm not going to say, oh, no, this just came together. No, I'm going to assume Henry Ford existed. And I feel like that's just the point. We're not going to find God within a test tube. We're not going to find him in the rocks. We're not going to find him in the trees. This isn't a pantheistic worldview. He's theistic. He created it. He's not in it. So we're not going to find God on the ground. We're not going to find him in the sky. We're not going to find him in the animals. He's not in them. He is not them. So the question isn't, okay, when we understand how the world works, do we need to find God within the equation? No. But the more we study what's in the equation, the more we should try to understand how that originated. The fact is that the more we do empirical science, the more complex and organized we find that the world is. And that makes it far, far more difficult to explain without God. The same with the Ford car. The more I study it, I keep studying it till kingdom come. The more I study it, the more complex I'm going to realize it is. And that makes explaining it without the existence of Henry Ford or an engineer far more difficult. So it's not that the more we do science, the less we need God. No, when you understand the distinction between empirical science and forensic science, that studying the day-to-day workings and studying its origin are different, we're going to find that the more we do science, the more we understand how complex and organized the workings of this world are, the exponentially more powerful the evidence for God is. See, to see the system and see how complex it is, we're not going to assume it came together by chance or by necessity. No, we rightly assume it came together by a mind. We don't need to find God within the equation. Like, oh, this atom joined with this atom, therefore God. Oh, no, it turns out that's a molecular reaction. No. But we find that, oh, but then these get grouped into organs and complex animals that are in complex life cycles in this complex world that is designed just right for them. No, we rightly assume the system is the result of a mind, even though we don't find that mind within its day-to-day workings. We assume that it originated by a mind. I've never experienced the presence of a God through intercession of angels, divine revelation, the miraculous act of divinity, or any occurrence of a supernatural event.
So I think this is interesting. But once again, like your own personal experience, firstly, does not discount the experience of others. Um, your lack of an experience doesn't disprove the ability or possibility that something could happen or actually has or will happen. Um, and then that's something I want to take you up on. You know, you ended with any occurrence of a supernatural event. Well, all you have to look at is near-death experience literature. Um, I think you'd be surprised how much wealth there is in the scientific literature about near-death experiences. And some people might say it's hallucinations. Well, there's been cases because this happens so often to millions and millions of people where they even give their testimonies, and they say, and the doctors and scientists in some of these studies, it's rare, but they'll say not only did they have no heartbeat, but their brain scan was basically done. It's like they had no brain waves. So there's people with no brainwaves and no heartbeat giving accounts of near-death experiences, like during the time that they had no brain activity and no heartbeat, and then giving knowledge that they couldn't have possibly had. And so those instances are rare when it's that credible, but that just means that there's that many, that might not have been that credible. Just because there's a few of them doesn't mean that those are the only ones. And then another thing to understand is the weight of testimony. I've always, growing up, I'm very evidence based, very evidence minded. I'm always looking empirically for evidence. And so when someone presented testimony as a form of evidence, I always thought that was weird. I'm like, well, they could be lying. But in a court of law, testimony carries weight, and it should when we give it to other people as well, especially when we rule out, some benefit they get from lying, some other thing like that. And so while you may have never experienced something supernatural, there's actually millions and millions of people, not only with near-death experiences, but religious experiences as well. And so I think it's just too much to discount based on the fact that you personally have never experienced it. We can't deny everything that we haven't experienced. I've never won the Super Bowl. Does the Super Bowl happen? Do people win it? Yeah. Is it a lot of people? Even less than near-death experience. So, we can't just deny things because we've never experienced them. That would be absurd.
Yeah, that's a great point. I feel like we can all relate to basing something on experience, like, oh, that hasn't happened to me. I've never seen that. So I might be skeptical at first, but that skepticism can only last so long in the face of evidence. And that's just the point. Like, okay, first, supernatural, miraculous experiences, they're not promised. They're not even like common. Like you said, they're rare. But that does not mean that there's not substantial evidence for them. And I think even another look at this is, okay, do we need a miraculous event to point to the existence of the supernatural? Not necessarily. In the book of Romans, in the New Testament, it talks about two types of revelation, two ways that we can know about God: general revelation and special revelation. Now, general revelation has to do with creation and conscience. Those are things that we all know. Creation, we do arguments about that. You can find our Evidence for God playlist, where we go through lots of arguments. Things that, yeah, you can go into the science about them, and they do point to an intelligent designer, a planner. You get the idea. And so that points to what revelation is all about. You don't need all the science. Those are things that are intuitively obvious. When we dig into science, it confirms what we find intuitively obvious, even without it, that there must be something else above and beyond the universe. But then there's special revelation, a way that we can all experience the supernatural, the literal word of God. And that's really what it is. I mean, you might assume from the get-go that it's not, but you might want to look into the confirmation. Is there good reason to believe that, okay, these men were writing what God told them to do? And I feel like the same thing with the experiences. You might assume that other people haven't had these experiences, even when faced with their testimony, just because it hasn't happened to you. But then that's going against your whole point earlier that I've never heard of someone give testimony that they can confirm. If you deny their testimony because it's never happened to you, then you're kind of going against your whole point. And it really just comes down to that. If you're basing it all on your own experience, your own life, then okay, what's the percentage of that to every other life ever lived in history? And there's a lot of miraculous events that are claimed, and lots of them are really backed up. So don't say there's no evidence for it. Just be willing to look at it and then see if they're substantiated by evidence.
Yeah, and one thing else, I feel like it's very hard to personally deny the existence of any supernatural. He qualified it with an event, but looking at the word supernatural, it just has to be something that isn't naturally detectable. And it's like how much do the laws of nature weigh? We can observe their effects, but why are they there? They don't weigh anything. We can't use our five senses to detect them. And yeah, we can see the effects of them, but that's not the same thing. And you can't say it's the same thing. The rules of football aren't the same thing as the game of football. And so, but they both exist. One of them exists materially, the game of football, but one of them exists non-materially. The rules, they can float in the air. They never have to even to be written down or known by anyone. If they've ever been started, they exist supernaturally, as in not in the natural. And so if you want to claim to deny these things, it just doesn't last.
All right, so next, number 9. Every phenomenon that I have ever observed has emerged from necessary and sufficient antecedents over time without exception. In other words, I've never observed a phenomena, entity, process, object, event, process, substance, system, or being that was created ex nihilo. That is, instantaneously came into existence by the solitary volition of a deity. Now, just before I pass this on to you, I want to make an important distinction. Creation ex nihilo does not mean created by the volition of a deity. Now, oftentimes we use this as an evidence that this God existed, that there's a cause that we would say is God. But to be created ex nihilo just simply means to be created out of nothing. So let's just get that term right. It doesn't mean created by the volition of a deity. It means created from nothing.
Why would you expect to? Why would you expect to? I mean, I'm sorry. Just what would make you think that you would expect to be observing something like that? Everything that's ex nihilo has to be within origins of things, and the origins of things is a long time ago. That's simply it. I mean, you just can't say that because you haven't observed something ex nihilo. And then your conclusion that instantaneously came into existence by the solitary volition of a deity. Um, those things happened a long time ago. So I guess your comment is true. You have never observed them, but that's not an argument. That's just saying that you've never observed them.
Yeah, well, that's something that we all agree on. Christians, atheists, we've never
I've
observed
never.
it.
Yeah, I've never.
Christians, we believe, in Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth. That happened in the beginning. And we don't claim that it's going to happen again since. So that's really something where we both agree. You're just using it as a reason to deny that it occurred in the past. Once again, does the fact that we don't observe it now mean it didn't happen in the past? No, just happening once is enough. And there's good scientific evidence that there was indeed a beginning. There are very few reasonable scientists nowadays that deny a literal beginning out of a literal nothing. Only few have tried to say that, oh no, this nothing really was something. It was a quantum vacuum. It was a wave function. No, lots of those arguments don't hold up. So very few people are going to say, no, there wasn't a beginning, or no, this was that nothing. Lots of people are just in the boat of, I don't know. I mean, Richard Dawkins says that cosmology is just, there's a lot we don't know yet. He admits that it's not looking very good right now, but he has to assume that, oh no, give enough time, we'll find something else that makes sense of this. Because right now, it's pointing to a literal beginning coming out of a literal nothing. And so we rightly assume that, okay, something must have caused it, and that nothing doesn't bring about anything, so it must be something apart from this world. We're saying that nothing of this world existed, not space, not time, not matter, not energy. There's good reason to believe all four of those came into existence. So whatever this causes, it must be beyond the natural world. It must be supernatural. So that's really what that is. I mean, you're basing on experience, but once again, it only happened once at the beginning, so you're not expected to see it again. No one argues that. Number 10, all claims of a supernatural or divine nature that I have encountered have been refuted to my satisfaction or do not present falsifiable.
I don't know what claims have been presented to you, and like that just makes it very hard for me because, like, I would agree with you on a lot of them. Yeah, I know that's a terrible way you're defending a claim. So this kind of just leaves me in the dark. This is not what you're saying, and it's not even implied much. But someone could say, "Oh no, all the claims are bad," which is not what you said, and it's not implied at all either. And then even then, you would have to say, "Let's go through them." So this is something that's even this claim the same conclusion. But like, let's talk about these. List them for me, and then maybe I can give you a response. But as it stands, like this is just thrown up in the air, and I don't know what I would respond to because I don't know what claims you've been presented with, and I don't know what it means to reach your satisfaction either. What's your criteria of skepticism, things like that. So it's just kind of leaving me in the dark.
Yeah. Well, now I ask what he means by refuted. Obviously, something that might be interesting for to think about is, okay, so God of the gaps, we already talked about that. That understanding the day-to-day workings of something and its origin are very different. So I would ask if lots of the arguments he thinks refute God are just ones that say, oh, look, this is how the world system works. So then that's not a refutation. That's just how it works. The question is, how did it originate? And then another interesting thing is, okay, is it an argument that proves God doesn't exist? Or is it an alternative explanation? An alternative explanation isn't a refutation. If Arthur says, hey, look at this clock that's right here on the ground. I just walked by and look, it's right here. And he says, oh, it must be the product of design. I say, no, it doesn't have to be the product of design. Look at the materials it's made of. See those mountains up there? You can find all those materials in there. I bet that gravity, it could have pulled it together. Lightning could have struck at the right moment. Even some rodents could have bitten off some sharp bits. It could have come together by all those pieces. Now, that's an explanation. That's a legitimate explanation. But that is not a refutation, and it's not the best explanation either. Because you don't need to refute something. You just need to find a better explanation. And atheism has done neither. It has not refuted the existence of God. We find that lots of the arguments are powerfully point to this intelligent designer, and that the only thing they give is explanations. We like to say that they just tell a tale. They just tell a story. And that does nothing to refute or even satisfy as far as the point that we say, oh no, this points to God. And as far as what you mean by it not being falsifiable, again, I don't really know what you mean by that. What we do is we just try to find the best explanation for this world. Now we see that God can exist. We can't just delete that. There aren't arguments to say that he can't. And we find that there's even evidence that says that he can exist. It's likely that he exists, this intelligent designer. Again, I don't want to use the word God too much because I feel like it's a vague term. But the question is, what's the best explanation? We rightly infer that the best explanation of design is a designer. So those are your 10 points. Now let's work just through your final comments. So all these facts lead me to the only rational conclusion that concurs with the realities I have been presented, and that is the fact that there is no good reason for me to acknowledge the existence of God.
Some of them, he didn't say their arguments, which is a proper statement because a lot of them were just personal experiential claims, testimony, but that just they didn't contribute to a case. And I would say, if these are all true, which we've gone over and said, yeah, we don't agree with the fact that they're all true, which means they're not facts, but they're facts of personal experience, or most of them are facts of testimony, which we can't say that you're wrong about that. So okay, we'll give you those, but not all of them are. Basically, if these were all true, maybe I'd agree with you because you say there's no good reason. And then I was thinking immediately, oh, no, let us present a case. But then in some of the points you said, oh, of all the cases I've heard, they're all bad. And which means that in one of your points, you said, of all the good reasons I've heard, none of them are good. And so, if these are all true and none of the reasons you heard are good, well, then your conclusion is correct. There's no good reason for you to acknowledge the existence of a God, but that's based on your case, which we don't agree with most of it at all. So your conclusion, um, like you said earlier, you wanted a valid logical argument. So with your facts, it was a valid logical argument, but it did not employ those sound premises that you talked about to reach your conclusion.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I ask you what you mean by facts. Lots of the things you've talked about have been operations, experience, what you see right now, both in your own life and in the operations within the world system. We've already explained that that doesn't explain the origin. In fact, it being more complex seems to point to the origin, pointing to a mind, an intelligent designer behind it all. And then you went on to say that it's the only rational conclusion to assume that, okay, God doesn't exist. So is there really no good reason to assume God doesn't exist? To illustrate really how much I think, to be honest, I think you might be misguided about this point, I'm going to quote Lee Strobel, who really has this great quote. So continue in atheism. He was an atheist to start, by the way. I would need to believe that nothing produces everything. Non-life produces life. Randomness produces fine-tuning. Chaos produces information. Unconsciousness produces consciousness. And non-reason produces reason. I simply didn't have that much faith. Is truly the only rational conclusion to assume that all these things come about from nothing, from chance, from mindless processes? Is that truly the only rational conclusion? Like we said in the beginning, no, the default conclusion is that this came from a mind. Now, maybe that turns out to be true, maybe it doesn't. We've seen that the evidence doesn't seem to point us further. As we dive into science more and more, we see the systems are far more complex, which confirm these initial intuitions. So are you really saying there's no good reason? No, we have complex life, we have fine-tuning, we have the origin of the universe, we have this moral law. Is there really no good reason to assume God is truly the only rational assumption that atheism is true, that God doesn't exist? I don't think so. Now, we often base our beliefs on evidence. That's a big word. I feel like we never really take the time to unpack. What does evidence mean? The agreed definition of evidence is the available facts and information indicating if a proposition or belief is true. Obviously, all that we have is what we have on hand, the information and facts that we have on hand. And what we have right now seems to indicate an intelligent designer behind the universe. Is there more to learn? Sure. We're not going to base our conclusions based on what we don't have, but we're going to base them on what we do have. And that's the only reasonable conclusion we can make. And the only reasonable conclusion based on what we do have is an intelligent designer behind life. So let's see the last bit. I have heard often that atheism is the denial of the Abrahamic God, but denial is the active rejection of a substantiated fact. Once credible evidence has been presented, atheism is simply withholding such acknowledgement until sufficient credible evidence is introduced. It is natural, rational, and prudent to be skeptical of unsubstantiated claims, especially extraordinary claims. So we started with that, but now we've gone through all the points. What's your take on that?
I've never heard someone say that atheism is the denial explicitly of the Abrahamic God. Maybe people in their minds think it's that. I think it's the denial of deity as a category of existence. So whether that's polytheism or monotheism, either way, it's more broad than just Abrahamic God. And then he says, and then he gives a definition of denial is the active rejection of a substantiated fact once credible evidence has been presented. I don't buy that at all. I just don't. I'm not going to use your definition. It's just no one, no one actually, no one actually uses denial in that way. Um, and most people don't think in matters of substantiated facts. You know, we use heuristics when in our day-to-day life, and we use denial and we deny heuristics, availability heuristics, things like that from psychology, just what's available. So not only are most facts, you know, we don't have them substantiated, though they might be, we don't have them that way. We deny them still. So I don't think this definition of denial is adequate. Um, I would say it's just denial of a claim. It doesn't even have to be a fact. Um, you know, in any situation where there's a disagreement, if there's one substantiated fact and people disagree, that means someone is denying something other than the substantiated fact, which is indeed true. So it seems like this is just an inadequate definition. And then your definition of atheism, this just is a radical redefinition of what it's meant historically. Um, this is more of agnosticism, and that's all I'm going to say. It's just as agnosticism. You're just using a different term than me, um, and not only me, but everyone throughout history. Basically, this is something that's new. This definition of atheism, not my definition, which is the belief that there is no God. This is more agnosticism, and then I wanted to start with the end because it's natural, rational, and prudent to be skeptical of unsubstantiated claims. I mean, is every claim unsubstantiated when you first hear it? Or, I mean, most claims are going to be unsubstantiated when you first hear it, unless you've already had prior experience. Like, if anyone tells you anything that you don't know about before, that doesn't mean you have to be skeptical about it. I mean, if Ash told me that he was just at basketball practice, which he did, and he just was at basketball practice, he hasn't substantiated it yet, but I'm not exactly that skeptical of it. Because it's not extraordinary. And then he says, especially extraordinary ones. Um, sure, extraordinary claims, but the idea of a God is intuitive. And so you could say, especially extraordinary ones, but you're talking about claims that comes out of people's mouth. The God that me and Ash worship, you know, his nature is something that seems intuitive to us from general revelation. So I just don't agree with the definition of denial. I don't agree with the definition of atheism. Um, and then I would say, yeah, I'm pretty skeptical of extraordinary claims, but the idea of God is intuitive, and that makes me not skeptical, and most people not skeptical.
Yeah. Well, you said that you're not going to basically believe in God unless there's substantial evidence for it, unless there's sufficient evidence. And that's really my question to you. What is sufficient evidence? What do you want? What are you looking for? Is what you'd require, is it reasonable? Or are you putting the bar so high that even if it's true, you could never know? So my next question is, what is substantiated? What's unsubstantiated? Believing everything came from nothing, life from non-life, fine-tuning from randomness, information from chaos, consciousness from unconsciousness, reason from non-reason. That's about as unsubstantiated and extraordinary as a claim can get. And that's what you have to assume in atheism. You see, that's what we don't have sufficient evidence for. That is what is unsubstantiated. That's an extraordinary claim. We should be skeptical about that. The fact is, it's natural, rational, and prudent to assume that the world is created by intelligence. It's natural, rational, and prudent to be skeptical about claims that all this complexity, all this order, all this life, all this reason, all this personality, all this beauty came together by random, brainless processes. The result of nothing, really, which is what we get to. That is what we should be skeptical of. No, the natural, rational, and prudent assumption is that this came from intelligence. Now the question is, what or who is this intelligence? Because we saw that's the best explanation is the causal capability, which is what we need in a scientific explanation. We also must ask, was it present? Now we find that intelligence is the only cause capable. And when that's the case in a scientific investigation, if it's the only suspect capable, we assume its presence. Now we see that intelligence is the only cause capable of producing all this order, all this information. So we assume it was present at the beginning of the universe. That's a scientific conclusion based on these two requirements. Is it capable? Is it present? It's the only one capable, therefore it must have been present. So intelligence is the only reasonable conclusion. Now the question is who or what is this intelligence? Now this is what we mean by God. Again, I'm never going to say that this argument proves deductively that God exists. You know, premise, therefore God. No, I'm never going to claim that just because God is a vague term. But we do get premise, intelligence, premise, planner, premise, designer. That's what we do get from arguments, and that's what we mean by God, once again. So this is about as close to demonstrating this quote-unquote God's existence as you can ever get. So my question for you is, after seeing all these claims, after seeing that the reasonable, really ground zero assumption is that God exists, and that our increased science shows that this world is complex in its orderly day-to-day workings, points to its origin, also pointing to intelligence, what more do you need? Now, we haven't really gone over the historical evidence for Jesus, who he was, so we haven't really proved Christianity. We haven't really proved anything here. But the point is, what would you need? Seeing that your assumptions might actually keep you from the truth, even if, say, God did exist, what would you need? What would you want? And is that reasonable? Is that fair? Or are your requirements keeping you from the truth, even if this is the truth?
Yeah, and like I said, we weren't making a case for something. We were making a response to what you said here, and in our responses are things that we believe to be true, which we believe to be substantiated, which is why we have other videos on them. We don't want to spend like 5 hours here trying to just substantiate all of our claims, but we're making a response to what you have said, and so that's why we did it the way we did. And then it ends with, I welcome any cordial response. Peace. Sorry if I was not that cordial. But yeah, feel free to leave a comment responding to what this video says if you do end up saying this. And then maybe we'll even do another one, maybe not. We'll see.